Our next speaker is Keisa Reynolds, and Keisa is a black feminist, writer, and community educator originally from Richmond, California. Yay! Over the last several months, they've organized with We Change Genocide, a grassroots intergenerational effort to center the voices and experiences of the young people most targeted by police violence and brutality in Chicago. Keisa has completed internships with In These Times, Rape Victim Advocates, Brava for Women in the Arts, and other nonprofits in the Bay Area and Chicago. She was also the 2014 Public Policy and International Affairs Fellow at the University of California, Berkeley. And because of that experience, she plans to pursue a career in social welfare and public policy. And upon graduation, they will be returning to the Bay Area, where they have just accepted a full-time job at the Richmond-based nonprofit organization Spark Point. They also plan to continue to freelance for In These Times. The title of Keisa's presentation is Race, Media, Culture, and the War on Drugs in Contemporary America. Did Black Lives Ever Matter? In this project, Keisa Reynolds reveals how mainstream newspapers, such as the New York Times and the San Francisco Chronicle, decontextualized the 2018 war on drugs in the United States. They argue that these decontextualized media representation not only shaped how the American public reacted and understood the new drug policies and laws, but also were influential in the rise of what came to be known as the prison industrial complex. This project combines critical insights and concepts from the fields of contemporary cultural studies, critical media studies, and critical race theory to interrogate the dominant ideological media representation of the crack cocaine epidemic and the so-called war on drugs. These representations, Reynolds claims, selectively and systematically curated and created the image of the typical criminal as the black subject from poor communities in metropolitan areas, thus naturalizing the criminalization and over-criminalization of black people, manufacturing the consent of the public to this as well, and as a result leading to the emergence of a prison industrial complex largely populated by young black people. Keisa?
We are in a historical moment where there's an entire movement demanding, in the streets, in the courts, in the academy, that Black lives matter. The trajectory of Black lives is mediated by a white supremacist capitalist society that began with slavery, moved to lynching and Jim Crow, then on to what the United States has called the war on drugs. These moments in US history have not moved from one to the other. This is happening on a continuum. Nearly 3 decades after the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which is one of the most significant drug policies, our society is starting to connect anti-Black racism to bad policies to the prison industrial complex. Today, we see the militarization of police forces in urban cities with large Black populations. The presence is heavy in Black neighborhoods that have been disenfranchised since the 1960s. Thanks to the media, we are able to see the militarization as it is formed and deployed. However, we are missing historical contexts that allow us to understand why Black communities are resisting. Structural violence has occurred in the form of policies and laws, defunding of social programs, and increased policing, all of which contributed to the anger and frustration of those who were out protesting today. This project is not exhaustive in exploring the ways that Black lives and communities have been disenfranchised. Its focus is on the media. This project provides context for understanding how the war on drugs continued to determine the trajectory of Black lives and how the media portrayed what the public has known as the crack cocaine epidemic. In 1982, President Reagan used Nixon's popularized phrase, war on drugs, to explain to the American public what was happening in the country. First Lady Nancy Reagan has been credited with the phrase, just say no, which was also an advertising campaign to end drug use among youth. Drug abuse resistance education, commonly known as DARE, was a way for law enforcement to work directly with students to educate them about drugs, crime, and violence. Even more than 30 years later, we can still find some vintage DARE apparel that has been purchased from thrift stores and worn by younger generations with limited history or no knowledge at all. Chutney shirts are not the only remnants of the war on drugs. The Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, was established in 1973 by the Nixon administration and has more than tripled its agents to 5,000 and holds a budget of $2.02 billion. Politicians and journalists associated crack cocaine with violence and crime to justify the establishment and expansion of the DEA, as well as the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 and 1988, which provided a total of $44 million to a grant program for urban law enforcement agencies and aided in the criminalization of poor, marginalized communities severely impacted by the distribution of crack cocaine. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 introduced mandatory drug sentences for the distribution of cocaine. Mandatory minimums for crack cocaine was introduced at 5 years versus the 37 months for powder cocaine. Michelle Alexander, author of The New Jim Crow, tells us Black people received far more punishment for distribution of crack, the drug associated with Blacks, than powder cocaine, the drug associated with whites. Prior to the mandatory minimum, the average drug sentence was 6% higher for Blacks than whites. Then in 1990, the average sentence for Blacks rose to 93%. Alexander makes the point that law enforcement cannot arrest every single individual drug criminal and says, police and prosecutors did not declare the war on drugs, and some initially opposed it. But once the financial incentives for waging the war became too attractive to ignore, law enforcement agencies had to ask themselves, if we are going to wage this war, where should it be fought, and who should be taken prisoner? Data has proven that the young African-American male was chosen as the target for such police strategy. Despite accounting for only 15 to 20% of the nation's drug user population, Black people made up half to 2/3 of drug offense arrests during the war on drugs. Contextualizing Black lives helps us understand how we interact with the structures of society as they impact others, how they impact the other. Our relationship with public affairs during the war on drugs was mediated by dominant ideologies that supported the criminalization of Black communities. The other was part of a problem in which law and drug enforcement needed to control. By contextualizing Black lives, we can come closer to understanding how we interact with an environment that has been constructed. When we rely on media as a main source of information, the media becomes the authority of the information it is presenting. The media is the curator of the images of the representation. In New York Times and San Francisco Chronicle, there is a chart of reporting largely on drug-related crimes and violence. And usually in the same article, there is mention of how law enforcement is forming strategies to combat it. The way it is framed makes it seem that law enforcement's drug squads are their solution. As media consumers and people encouraging policies, there is little opportunity to connect the dots to the larger picture of an entire system. Walter Lippmann and Public Opinion introduced the idea of media as the source of pictures in our heads, and how that sets up our understanding of realities, including our own. Lippmann describes how news mediates our relationship with our own environments. He claims that, looking back, we can see how indirectly we know the environment in which, nonetheless, we live. We can see that the news of it comes to us now fast. Whatever we believe to be a true picture, we treat as if it were the environment itself. So we understand our environments by living in them and how they are presented to us in other forms. We may begin to treat our environment based on the relationship we believe we're supposed to have with it. In a way, we do not even trust our brains to conceptualize our environments based on our own experiences. To take that further, we are probably more likely to rely on representations of others' realities based on images presented to us. Those representations can set precedents for how we judge others in their own environments. Despite us being outside of that environment, we feel a sense of authority of how that environment should be treated. An article in the New York Times on May 22, 1986, reported on the city setting up a new drug squad and quoted the police commissioner. Crack has become, in a very short period of time, the drug of choice in New York City. We believe it is leading to violent crime. The commissioner also cautioned that it was too early to make a precise correlation between increases in violent crime and the use of crack. The first comment sets up the argument that violent crime has increased as crack cocaine becomes more prominent in New York City. Prior to the commissioner's statement, he made a reference to the case of a 19-year-old alleged crack user who killed a 49-year-old priest. As receivers of this information, New York City residents might actually want a drug squad if the reasoning is that individual crack users may murder another beloved member of the community. This is a sad story that helps frame NYPD's drug squad as the solution. More murders cannot be prevented despite the fact that there is not a direct link between violent crimes and crack. Michael Parenti's Inventing Reality, The Politics of New Media provides an in-depth look at the ways news media controls how we understand the images presented to us. As he puts it, the press can effectively direct our perceptions when we have little information to the contrary, and when the message seems congruent with earlier notions about events, notions that themselves may be partly media created. In this way, the new information is a reinforcement of earlier perceptions. Thinking about ideology and our individual relationship to social relations, if we do not have a direct relationship to what we see in the media, our perceptions are based on what has been produced for us. Parenti also reminds us that even if the press does not mold our every opinion, it does mold opinion of visibility. It can frame the perceptual limits around which our opinions take shape. We may not be controlled by the media. However, news media has framed stories to inspire an understanding of a situation or to garner support for one side over another. This can be done both intentionally and unintentionally because we have to be aware that journalists are people who are capable of incorporating biases into news at their own discretion, their bosses, or their corporate offices. On November 24th, 1986, New York Times journalist Peter Kerr wrote, "Drug use in affluent areas is generally more discreet and harder to observe." That brings up the question of how hard affluent areas were actually being observed by law enforcement and government officials. A quote from an expert then says, "There are certainly middle-class people who are using crack, but primarily we are seeing young adults in the inner city." Kerr first mentions increases in murders, robberies, and violent crimes in areas where crack is widespread in New York City. This sets up an image of crack being the main cause of laws being broken, and that is not a concern in neighborhoods where there is more wealth. The effect of this image is startling. A 1995 study discovered that 95% of respondents pictured a Black person after being asked to envision a drug user. Media played a major role in that image being constructed, as another study showed that 60% of viewers believed that the perpetrator was Black when they saw a story with no image. Lippmann tells us, "The only feeling that anyone can have about an event he does not experience is the feeling aroused by his mental image of that event." This is an excellent way to summarize how even if people have not had interactions in environments where crack is distributed, they react based on the information delivered to them, and they process that information as fact. Regularly seeing and hearing about the drug-related incidents draws outsiders to the environment that is being presented. When outsiders think of an environment, they may think of constant shootings, drug deals on every inch of the neighborhood, children in and out of foster care, and mothers on the street looking to sell their bodies. As Lippmann puts it, they live, we are likely to say, in different worlds. More accurately, they live in the same world, but think and feel in different ones. So in conclusion, the idea of otherness allows the picture in consumers' heads to focus on Black communities when imagining drug dealers, violent criminals, crack babies, mothers on welfare, and other stereotypes. Today, the script of mainstream media has not changed. In the wake of uprisings in Ferguson, Missouri, and Baltimore, Maryland, we have heard journalists and politicians describe protesters as criminals and thugs. The resistance is narrated as unwarranted and unlawful. Fortunately, we're living in an age where social media exists and allows for personal narratives to be shared and used as context for issues that are impacting Black lives. We're able to take a glimpse into the lived realities of Black communities that were targeted by drug policies and continue to be impacted by political decisions made decades ago. Those who do not hold all faith in mainstream media can use current platforms for gathering unbiased facts, as well as historical context. We can watch footage from CNN that is distinctively different from footage from a live stream provided by Black residents in the crowd. The picture in our head does not have to be controlled by mainstream media. Now it can be an actual representation of a very real environment. Many of us have been taught that people are responsible for the conditions in which they live. We're not supposed to blame the outside for our environments. So when we have the public looking at Black communities here in Chicago, in Ferguson, in Oakland, California, as criminals, we are stripping away the context of policing and mass incarceration that are direct consequences of policies and laws that targeted Black people in the United States. My goal for this project was to announce that this is not a new phenomenon. Black lives have not mattered in this country. We see that in our governments and in our personal lives. We see this idea being reproduced in the media. We are not seeing riots, we are seeing uprisings. Whether or not mainstream media co-signs, Black lives matter. Thank you.